Hi, I'm Jonathan Parker, and this is my partner Sharon Kelly Perella, and we're the Parker and Kelly team at RE/MAX Encore, and welcome to Real Estate Talks. Today we're going to discuss and give potential homeowners and homeowners in Wilmington an update on and educate them on resource areas, the Wetlands Protection Act, and how that could affect and will your property.
So I would like to start out by introducing Ryan Hale and give a little information about Ryan. Ryan is a professional wetland scientist and has been the Wilmington Conservation Agent in the Department of Planning and Conservation since July of 2017. Prior to that, he was an environmental consultant for 13 years in the private sector, primarily for energy, transportation, and various other commercial and industrial projects. His background and experience are identifying wetland resource areas, environmental permitting, and construction stormwater management.
Welcome, Ryan. Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.
Can you tell us what wetland resource areas are?
Sure, yeah. This is a really important topic in Wilmington. It affects a lot of people because there are a lot of wetland resources in town. So basically, wetland resources are defined in the State Wetlands Protection Act. And they're regulated by the Department of Environmental Protection and the local Conservation Commission. In general, most regulated wetlands are what people would typically see out there: wetlands, streams, rivers, ponds, things like that. But there are a couple resource areas that a lot of people aren't too familiar with. One of them is the FEMA 100-year floodplain,
Right.
which is a little bit of a misnomer, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. As well as the riverfront area, which is the area within 200 feet of streams that flow year-round, which are called perennial streams. These areas sometimes can be very difficult to identify. I hear a lot of folks say, well, the standing water is over there, but sometimes it's groundwater that's causing the wet conditions. And in Massachusetts, a lot of the wetlands are defined by vegetation. So if you have enough water, either surface water or groundwater, creating the conditions for the wet species to grow, that defines your wetland essentially. So the best advice I can give anybody watching is to call our office if you have any questions, or if you're not sure if wetland resource areas are present. Our phone number is 978-658-8238. And I'm going to plug that numerous times throughout this because we want people to call us.
We encourage that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, everybody, if you're buying a house in town, you really need to go and visit Ryan.
Yep.
Or if you own a house in town and you want to know about wetland, go visit Ryan.
Right.
So Ryan, and I hear this all the time, conservation land. I have conservation land. What is the difference, or is there a difference between the wetland resource area and conservation land? What exactly does either one of them mean?
Yeah, it's a common, I don't want to call it a mistake, because the Conservation Commission regulates both areas, so it's understandable that it would be, people would consider conservation land and wetland resource areas the same. But the main distinctions are that conservation land is town-owned public land. It's defined by parcel boundaries, and it's set aside for conservation purposes and passive recreation, like hiking and fishing and things like that. It's under the care and control of the Conservation Commission, as I mentioned, and conservation land can include wetland resource areas on it. So you can have wetlands and streams flowing through a parcel of land that is conservation land. Wetland resource areas, on the other hand, can be owned by anybody.
Okay.
And one thing I hear often, is that there's wetlands on a property and the town owns them. But if it's private property, the homeowner owns those wetlands.
Right.
But the Wetlands Protection Act still applies to those wetland resource areas.
So just to ask you quickly, so if it's on a homeowner's property, they are responsible for that wetland?
That's correct.
Wetland resource area.
I was exactly, what does that mean? So I'm a current resident in town, what does that mean for my property?
Right.
Yeah, so I mean, the main point is there are certain, if you wanted to do an activity in a wetland resource area, you may or may not need approval from the Conservation Commission. That's the main point. And so that's why we want people to come in early in their project planning, so that we can discuss that with them, maybe, and figure out if the wetland resource areas are actually present and what might be required.
So if you have wetlands, how do you even know? How do you even know if it's on or near your property?
Yep.
How do you define it? Because that's not the easiest thing to figure out.
Sure,
Right.
yeah, and that is
The million-dollar
probably
question.
the biggest
Yeah.
issue,
Yeah.
right? So there are a few different resources we use as our first look. So there's available mapping online, wetlands mapping.
Do you have a website they can
floodplain
go to?
mapping. Yeah, Wilmington has a public GIS website.
Yes, it does.
And
That's
it has 2 different wetland layers on it. It has the floodplain layer on it, and a bunch of other stuff too that's very important for conservation and other stuff. So I encourage people to take a look at that.
Excellent.
But basically, we'll take a look at the mapping. We'll do a file review. Sometimes there's previous files which identify exactly where the wetland resources are on a property. And if we can't figure it out that way, sometimes I'll just go do a site visit. And sometimes other professional services may be needed.
So is it in fact true that it can be not standing water, but just defined by vegetation sometimes?
Yes, absolutely. And
Yeah.
so,
That's hard.
with the 100-year floodplain and with riverfront
Right.
area, those areas portions of those areas may literally never see water.
Right.
So if you think of a stream with steep slopes on the side of it, and the area within 200 feet of that, well, if you get to the top of the hill, that's never going to see water, but that's still
Right.
in
Within.
riverfront
Still in
area,
riverfront.
right? So,
Okay.
so wetland resource area, it's called that because it's under the Wetlands Protection Act, but they're not all wetlands.
Understood. What are typically some activities that may require approval from the commission if I am in the water district or the 100-foot buffer zone?
So in general, if you're going to be altering a wetland resource area, which means excavation, filling, grading, removal of natural vegetation, installing structures, those are the big 5, really. And some of that may or may not be exempt from the regulations,
Right.
depending on how far away they are from the resource. And as we go through this, you can see how complex some of these assessments can be. So again, it's very important for people to come in early. I think the biggest issue that I receive a lot of calls about is tree removal, especially with all the storms we've been having. A lot of people want to remove trees, and rightfully so. It's understandable, but for certain areas there is an approval process for that.
Right.
So someone has to, if you are doing anything on your property, if you want to add an addition on, you are required to get a building permit. So what happens, what I see happen is that a lot of people go in, they go through the departments to get their signatures, they end up at the Planning and Conservation and find out that, you have to file with Conservation. So maybe you could touch on that for a minute on, that's kind of where people find out that they all of a sudden have conservation or wetland on their property or about it. So maybe you could talk about that, because I hate to see it. It always comes up at the very last minute.
Right.
Yeah, and we do get a lot of building permits that end up
Yeah.
sitting in our office for a while because of that, and we like to move them as quickly as we can too. But again, coming in early in your project planning.
Sure.
So if you're putting an addition on before you even get a site plan, before you even define even the boundaries of what you want to do,
Right.
you should figure out if the wetland resources are present on your property and what that might mean. The addition may or may not even be in a
Right.
resource area 100-foot buffer, but as part of our building permit review, we're not going to sign off on it until that's determined. And if you need
Okay.
an approval, we won't sign off on it until you actually get that approval.
And what is the process to get the approval?
So the first step is to identify the resource areas. There's an application process that includes a form, site plans.
Sure.
There are a couple different types of applications, but in general, it's a form and a site plan, some additional information, describing the wetlands as needed, and then it becomes a public process. So you
Right.
submit your application, and then as long as everything looks good, we get you on the next Conservation Commission agenda.
How often do you guys meet?
The first Wednesday of every month.
Perfect, okay.
And applications typically need to be in at least 2 weeks prior.
Okay.
If there's a holiday or some other circumstance, sometimes 3 weeks. So we post all of those deadlines on our website.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So what types of residential activities are exempt from the wetland protection?
Yeah, and this is important because sometimes I can help people design their project so that it is actually becomes exempt. And you know, if you just have to move things a few feet in a certain direction, like an addition or something like that, it can really save you a lot of time. So, but in general, the first and foremost thing I want to say is mowing your legally existing lawn and maintaining your existing landscaped areas is exempt.
Right.
Other activities that are in the 100-foot buffer zone or the riverfront area, only those two areas are called minor activities, and they're also exempt. So the most common example are accessory residential structures. So you're talking about decks, sheds, pools,
Play structure.
play structure. As long as they're 50 feet away from the wetland or the stream and they're on existing lawn, that does not need approval.
Okay.
So that's one of the big ones, and a lot of people fall into that, or they can design their project to fall
based
into.
on
Would
that.
that include like a fire pit?
Yeah, stuff
Okay.
like that. Yep,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay.
The other one is fences.
Yeah, that's huge.
That's a big one. We get
Right.
a lot of those. So again, this is only for the 100-foot buffer in the riverfront area. If the fence is designed to allow for wildlife passage, and the general rule of thumb for wildlife passage is a 6-inch gap at the bottom of the fence,
Okay.
it's exempt.
For any type of fence.
Any type of fence.
Okay.
Yep. There are some other minor activities for like walkways and pruning vegetation, converting an impervious surface to impervious.
Do you want to tell everybody what that means?
Sure. So impervious surface is anything that doesn't allow water to infiltrate into the ground. So pavement, houses. So if you were going to, let's say, take a driveway and turn that into yard, that's obviously a benefit,
Right.
to the wetlands. So that's exempt.
Okay.
Yep.
Understood.
So what is the whole approval process? Someone has to fill out an application. Do they need engineers? Do they have to come on their own? I mean, when they come and meet in front of the commissioners, what exactly happens? I would imagine if you're not familiar with it and you don't do it on a regular basis, it would appear pretty scary,
Right, intimidating.
intimidating.
But it's not.
Yeah, yeah.
We do try to, and as you know, it's a lot less formal than I think people
It
are
is.
anticipating.
For sure.
Sometimes you hear you have to go in front of a board or commission, and it's a deer in headlights. But I think the Conservation Commission does a good job of kind of just making people feel comfortable. But essentially, the process is the Conservation Commission will review the application. DEP also reviews the application, and essentially, as long as all the standards are met, the Conservation Commission can approve the project.
Right.
Once it's approved, there's a 10 business day appeal period after that, and then the work can start after that.
Okay.
That's a quick version of the process. And the public hearing is, in terms of professional services, you may or may not need professional services, an engineer, land surveyor, a wetland scientist, and our office can absolutely help people with that.
Prior to them even applying.
Prior to,
They're
yep.
going, you would advise them on what you suggest that they do,
Right.
such as hiring an arborist on trees, or whether they're alive or they're dead, et cetera, et cetera. So can you touch on the buffer? You're talking about the 100-foot buffer zone, but what I have not heard is there a limit of how close you can get to wetland if in fact you're adding an addition or putting up a fence or anything that is going to be a permanent structure?
So the 100-foot buffer zone is basically a review area. The Wetlands Protection Act it's not a resource area. The Wetlands Protection Act does not say what you can and can't do really in the buffer zone in terms of distance to the wetland, the activities. What it does do is give the Conservation Commission discretionary authority to review projects on a case-by-case basis and make decisions as to what is needed in the buffer zone to protect the wetland. And that can be Let's say there's a house being built in the 100-foot buffer zone, erosion controls during
Right.
construction to prevent erosion. Another one is a vegetated buffer between the wetland and the work,
Okay.
just to maintain some protection there.
Okay.
But the Wetlands Protection Act doesn't stipulate that. The commission does have a couple policies, a 15-foot no disturb policy from the wetland and a 25-foot no structure policy. And those are essentially starting points for conversation.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and good to know. Well, thanks for coming out today. We appreciate it. We can't stress enough, if you're purchasing a house in Wilmington or going to really do any alterations to or around your property, you really should stop by Town Hall and visit Ryan. Do you want to just give everybody your phone number again?
Sure, it's 978-658-8238, and my email address is rhale@wilmingtonma.gov.
That's great. Thank you, Ryan,
Yeah,
for
thanks.
coming forward.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Have a great day.
Thanks.